Hello everyone, welcome to the webinar on humanitarian energy. Okay, let me start again. Hello everyone, webinar on humanitarian energy insights presenting recent humanitarian assessments. My name is Elif Güldemir from the GPA Coordination Unit, and I will be your moderator for this webinar. And this webinar is the first part of a webinar series organized by Mercyco and Energy for Impact with support from the GPA Coordination Unit. And the series is based on assessments conducted by Mercyco and Energy for Impact back in June 2022 in 4 countries. And in today's webinar, we'll be hearing about the Uganda and Rwanda assessments. The second webinar will be focusing on assessment findings from Somalia and Niger on the 13th of December. We hope that you can join us for the second one as well. And for those of you who might not be familiar with the GPA, we are a global platform working to achieve SDG 7 in displacement settings so that it is inclusive of displaced communities like refugees, internally displaced people, asylum seekers, and their host communities. We achieve this by working at 3 levels like global, operational, and country, and 5 different working areas, as you can see on the slide. And if you want to know more about the GPA, you can visit our website at www.humanitarianenergy.org. So let's take a quick look at the agenda. We'll kick off today's webinar with an introduction from Emmanuel Azibor at Mercyco, followed by the presentation on findings in Uganda and Rwanda from Laura Patel at Energy for Impact. After the presentations, we'll have a Q&A session. And after 4 p.m. CET, we'll keep the discussion going in a more informal way for people who are interested in diving deeper into this topic. So please stay on the call if you have the time and you want to delve more deeper into this topic. And throughout the presentation, please feel free to use the chat function for your comments and questions to the presenters. So now I would like to give my virtual mic to Emmanuel Azibor from Mercyco for giving us an introduction to study. Over to you, Emmanuel.
Thank you very much, Elif, and I would like to take this opportunity to welcome again all of us to this webinar. And as Elif mentioned, this is part of a 2-part series, and we very much encourage your participation in the part 2 of this. So Enter Energy is Shell's social investment vehicle that seeks to develop sustainable energy solutions for displaced populations and host communities. So in Enter Energy, we focus basically our model on displaced populations. Through Enter Energy Ethiopia, which is our first pilot country, Mercyco and Shell have been working together to deploy and operate clean, commercially viable energy infrastructure for displaced populations in the Somali region in Ethiopia. As part of Enter Energy's commitment to increase energy access, Mercyco, with funding from Shell, collected data on additional countries with potential to expand the Enter Energy pipeline into. Mercyco, with Energy for Impact, completed this energy assessment across 4 countries in Rwanda, Uganda, Somalia, and Niger. The aim is really to understand what is the current and projected energy need, spanning across lighting, powering, productive uses, and clean cooking for people in displaced camps in these 4 countries. The key research areas which was covered by this particular assessment include a regulatory framework to really understand what is the governing regulations and laws regarding operating commercial energy vehicles in such countries. We also took the opportunity to engage with key stakeholders that operate in the humanitarian energy space, governments, private sector, other humanitarian organizations that are doing similar work in this particular context. We also studied what are the relevant current or projected interventions at the national and the site level to really see what are the gaps that interventions could really fit into. We looked at a lot of issues related to current incomes, levels around affordability, ability to pay as well. Lastly, the research also focused on what is current and projected energy use and its priorities for these communities. It is very important for us to understand these key research items or areas which will really guide potentially future design options. Today's webinar will focus on Uganda and Rwanda, and I'd like to hand over to Laura. Elif, if you permit, to take us deep dive into the work. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Emmanuel, and over to you, Laura.
Thank you, Elif and Emmanuel, for that introduction. And again, thank you for joining our webinar today. I feel like there's been lots of webinars in the past few weeks, so I appreciate you taking the time to listen to this one. Yeah, my name is Laura Clough Patal. I work with Energy for Impact, and I was part of the team that completed the assessments in Uganda and Rwanda. So it's very difficult to condense 6 months worth of work into around 10 slides for a webinar. So I've tried my best. And really the idea is to give you a snapshot of some of the findings from this assessment and what might be some of the key facts and considerations for stakeholders that may be looking to implement energy interventions. So if we go to the next slide, Elif. So yeah, I'm going to start with Uganda. And also to note that in Uganda, for example, there's 13 refugee settlements, and we were not able to cover all of them in this assessment. So we decided to select 4, and this selection was done in conjunction with discussions with the Mercy Corps Country Office in Uganda, and also looking at some secondary data on the current situation. And based on that, we decided to focus our assessments in Bidi Bidi, in Palarinya, in Adjumani, and in Palabek, which are all settlements in the West Nile region. And so for these assessments, we conducted surveys in 3 of the sites. So all of the sites except for Bidi Bidi. We didn't do assessments in Bidi Bidi because we had access to some previous assessments that were done a few years ago. But we did do focus group discussions and key informant interviews there, as well as the other sites. And in the other sites, we also did household surveys and business surveys. And then at the national level, we also did some more key informant interviews with stakeholders, and we also conducted a market engagement workshop targeting the private sector to also get their views. So also to say the bulk of this data was collected between February and May this year. So what we're presenting today is from that time period. If there's been some development since then, it may not be reflected. I think another thing to note is, particularly places like Bidi Bidi and Adjumani, they're very large, the settlements are spread out over very large areas. And so it was not always possible to visit every part. For example, Adjumani consists of 16 smaller settlements in the district, and we only sampled 4 of these. So again, this was really a kind of sample and to get a high-level understanding of areas that may warrant further investigation and feasibility. So we'll go to the next slide. Yeah, so to set the scene, we'll just look at the humanitarian context in Uganda. And Uganda is one of the largest refugee hosting countries in the region. At the time of our assessments, it was hosting more than 1.5 million refugees. And alongside these, there's also around 2.5 million host community members. So, you know, there's quite a large population in these regions. In these countries, in Uganda, most of the refugees have come from South Sudan, particularly in the West Nile region, since 2016. And also from the DRC, and you'll see some of the statistics there in the graph. And Uganda generally has quite favorable policies for refugees. It promotes refugee self-reliance, gives refugees the right to work and to access financial services. Also, Uganda has developed a sustainable energy response plan for refugees in the host communities, which is one of the first of its kind and really helps to set out the vision of the government in supporting energy access in these areas, and also helps to improve coordination and also resource mobilization, and helps to provide an entry point for development actors to come in and support this area. And most of the refugees in the West Nile and in the sites we looked were from South Sudan, and it's mainly kind of a rural setting where people are quite heavily dependent on natural resources. So if we go to the next slide. In terms of the energy market context, this data is slightly outdated, but the World Bank indicators for 2019 showed around 41%, the national electricity access rate. So that's likely to have increased today. The energy market is quite well regulated, and there's several policies in place around renewable energy to support renewable energy and also to support rural electrification. Excuse me. For example, the electricity connections policy is subsidizing connections for people within proximity of the grid. And Uganda also has the National Electrification Plan, which provides a blueprint for achieving universal energy access. And the same is for that to come from around 88% on grid and then around 12% off grid. And again, there's quite a vibrant private sector in Uganda. There's several providers of solar home systems and clean cooking solutions, providing those products in the country. But again, there's quite a heavy reliance on biomass fuels. Again, latest statistics, still outdated here from 2017, we're showing around 95% of households still reliant on biomass. However, the government is promoting electric cooking. MEX has also been supporting this in Uganda. And they did recently introduce a cooking tariff to try and support the promotion of electric cooking. And apologies, I actually had a sore throat last week and it's playing up a bit. So I'm just going to take a sip of water. So we can see that overall there's a good regulatory foundation for implementing energy interventions in Uganda. So we'll move to the next slide. Again, there's several different types of stakeholders that need to be involved in the delivery of energy solutions in displacement settings. So, for example, the displaced communities themselves are very important in the design and understanding their needs. There's also various humanitarian actors. UNHCR are very important in terms of their coordination role of the sector. Again, WFP have a strong role in cash distribution, in clean cooking. So it's important to coordinate and align with these stakeholders. Also, again, at in the settlement level, in most settlements, there's various stakeholders that are already implementing energy interventions, such as LWF and Church 8, for example. And again, there's several government stakeholders such as OPM and the Ministry of Energy, who regulate both the humanitarian and the energy sector. There's several donors and development partners that are quite involved in Uganda. For example, the World Bank is planning an intervention looking at energy in humanitarian settings in the country. And then there's also opportunities. Sorry. Sorry, apologies for coughing into the mic. My throat is playing up a bit. Yeah, and there's opportunities to learn from past programs, particularly those that have taken market-based approaches, such as Mercy Cause, Ampere Project, and also GIZ's project. Finance providers are also important, and there's several that are active in the West Nile region. And again, the private sector partners. And again, there's several that are already in the towns and in the region that are providing products, but maybe just need support to make those products more available closer to the settlements. Okay, we'll move to the next slide. So looking a bit more at some of the data that came out of the surveys, in general, we found that the household incomes, they varied across segments, but were overall quite low, both in the refugee and in the host community. The households that were engaged in an income generating activity was often subsistence farming, and there were smaller amounts of trade and agri-processing. So there is, we didn't find any of the households connected to the national grid, although there are grid extension plans in several of the camps, and also several of the towns near to the refugee settlements do have grid connections. So within the camps, the vast majority of households are still using inadequate energy sources, such as dry cell batteries and firewood for cooking. And we saw the current spending on energy was quite low. We saw it slightly higher for fuels compared to lighting. But we felt there was some product demand and willingness to pay across all of the sites. Most of the businesses interviewed had a source of lighting, but it was mainly solar lanterns or solar home systems. In terms of the humanitarian response, a lot of the agencies were based in the town, so they had grid connections, or they were using backup solar home systems, backup solar systems as well. And energy for social institutions were still lacking within the camps as well. Okay, we'll go to the next slide. So this is a table just summarizing some of the data to support these observations. And I can just give you a couple of a minute or two to look at them. So again, you'll see kind of household incomes varied. They seem to be higher in Bidi Bidi and Adjumani, maybe more economic opportunities there. Again, expenditure on lighting was quite low. It was slightly higher for cooking fuels. And then there was, again, some expressed desire for more cooking and lighting options. Yeah, we'll go to the next slide. Again, just sharing some more of the data. We see dry cell batteries, which again is indicating torches being used by many households. We saw in Palabek, there were solar home systems being used. Again, there are some grid extension plans. There have also been feasibility studies in several of the sites for mini grids, although it wasn't always possible to understand which ones were going ahead, but that's something to bear in mind when looking at these sites and electrification interventions. Majority of households were cooking with firewood at the sites, and there was a smaller use of charcoal. And again, we saw mainly the use of traditional stoves. Bidi Bidi seemed to have a higher number of households that were using improved stoves. So to the next slide. In terms of the market ecosystem, it's worth bearing in mind that while some of the sites have big populations, they're often spread out over larger distances. And sometimes the marketplaces are quite small and fragmented within the camps. But generally, the ecosystem conditions were favorable. There's good security and relations with the host community. Mobile money usage was high, as well as mobile phone ownership. And there was experience of kind of using credit, especially with informal credit services. There's potential private sector partners to work with. So there are quality products within the region, but it's more about bringing those products down to the settlement level. But again, there's some experience with distributed products at all of the sites. and kind of varying transport networks as well across some of the sites. Some kind of had better roads, some had airport connections as well. Okay, on to the next slide. Again, this was some of the data that supported those observations. So we can see kind of semi-formal and an informal banking experience was slightly higher. Access to mobile money was fairly high as well. Yeah, we can go to the next slide. In terms of how energy interventions can align with stakeholder policies and priorities, they align quite well with government priorities to promote rural electrification and clean cooking. And Uganda does have this refugee response plan specific to energy, which is really positive. I think energy interventions need to bear in mind future grid extension plans and also other programs, such as the Planned World Bank program, to see how they can align with them where possible. Other priorities sometimes came up in terms of education and healthcare when it came to community priorities, but at the same time, household energy also came out strongly across all of the sites. Particularly household lighting, and for businesses, access to electricity and finance was a strong priority. And most sites have some form of livelihood programming that interventions can support. Yeah. So on to the next slide. Again, just some of the data we had to support these observations. So we can see some of the community priorities that came out, and also for the businesses. We'll go to the next slide. Yeah, so to summarize on Uganda, I think what we saw are some of the potential opportunities. I think there's definitely opportunities to increase energy access for households and businesses. And there appears to be a need and a priority for the communities. Standalone solar energy appears viable in all of these locations, and also in looking at increasing energy for businesses, particularly in areas where the grid won't be covered. But even in those locations where grid extension may happen, there's still opportunities to support households and businesses to get energy appliances and stimulate that demand for the electricity. There's also opportunities to scale interventions that have already taken place, working with businesses that are already developing models for the community, such as Pasitho, Mandalis Energy is another example. So working with programs that have already started to build things within these areas. Given the low income levels, it is likely that subsidies may be needed to bridge the affordability gap, or it may be credit products may be needed. And future interventions may also need to be coupled with awareness raising and also demand stimulation for energy appliances. There also remain some barriers to private sector intervention that can be supported through interventions such as streamlining access, and again, raising awareness and looking at models to support end user purchasing power. So yeah, that summarizes Uganda. I'm sorry that my throat is giving up on me a bit today. I think we have a poll question from Elif before we move on to Rwanda.
Yes, thank you so much, Laura, for sharing these insights while recovering from your throat infection. So let's give you some time to recover and refresh, and have the poll question up. So the question is, what activities or actions do you think should be prioritized to support increased access to energy in displacement settings in Uganda? And you can select up to 3 options, and you can see all of them on your screens right now. I'll keep it up for a couple of seconds so you can join, and then we will continue with the results. So some of the options are de-risking grants for private sector energy companies, access to flexible commercial funding for energy companies, access to end user financing for energy appliances and services, access to finance for local businesses to purchase energy appliances, subsidizing the price of energy appliances and services, awareness and marketing campaigns on energy products and services, supporting government policies and access to settlements, increased community engagement in designing and implementing energy interventions. And if you have any other actions that you think need to be prioritized, please feel free to add them to the chat and we will get back to them. So right now I'm seeing top. Oh, it's changing quite quickly. So I'll just give you a few more seconds to join the poll. We have one more option on the chat coming from Robin saying links to carbon offset trades, and Claudine saying that need for technical support to product distributors to strengthen their business models for scale. Okay, I think we can end the poll now and see what the others have prioritized. So we see that the front runner is the access to end user financing for energy appliances and services. I think this really highlights the importance of the affordability issue in energy services. And Laura, if you have any comments or reflections on the full questions, please feel free to share as well.
Thanks, Elif. Yeah, I think that was something that came out very strongly from our surveys. But I think also showing that there's quite an array of different actions and activities that are needed. It's not just one single thing. Yeah.
Thank you everyone for joining the poll, and please keep the questions coming on the chat. And let's move on to the Rwanda assessment insights. Back to you, Laura.
Thank you, Elif. We'll move to the first slide. So again, in Rwanda, we were not able to survey all of the sites. So we decided to do the assessments in Nyabiheke and Mahama. And this was really based on, them having a slightly larger size and population that may offer scale. There'd been the population of Mahama has been increasing, kind of lower risk of camp closure, and also based on previous work in Nyabiheke that's been done under the RE4R program that may present opportunities. So we decided to complete the surveys in those two sites, and we followed a similar approach to in Uganda with the household surveys, conducting key informant interviews and a market engagement workshop. And again, it was a similar time period that we did the assessments, and that's the period that the data we're presenting is from. So if we go to the next slide. So to follow a similar format and give you the context in Rwanda, at the time of the assessments, Rwanda was hosting around 126,000 refugees and asylum seekers, and mainly from the DRC and from Burundi. Again, Rwanda has favorable policies to support refugees and their integration into society, including freedom of movement and the right to work and own a business. And there's also government policies that are promoting the economic inclusion of refugees, and they're also included in targets around financial inclusion, which is really positive. The sector is well coordinated by the government, but I think before the RE4R program, perhaps limited energy interventions. Again, in the past few years, we've seen some of the camps being consolidated due to concerns on aging infrastructure. Also, the refugee population from Burundi has arrived more recently in Rwanda, and as the political situation there is stabilizing, some are deciding to return home. whereas the Congolese refugees have been in Rwanda for a longer period of time, and there's more focus around integrating them into national systems. So if we go to the next slide. In terms of the energy market context in Rwanda, the current electricity access rate stands at about 75%, around 51% of this from the national grid, and then also 24% from off-grid solutions. And the government aims to achieve universal access to electricity by 2024. And again, it has a national electrification plan to achieve this, through which it's expected around 30% will be through off-grid solutions. Both Mahama and Nyabeheki do fall in the grid extension zone, and there are connections to the national grid, but they're not connecting households within the camp, but they do connect the host community as well as some institutions and business centres in the camps. The government also has a strong aim to reduce the reliance on biomass in the country and to increase the use of LPG. And there's several donor-backed programs that are supporting them in these aims. And this includes the World Bank, the Energy Access Quality Improvement Program. I hope I've got that right, but that's looking to subsidize the cost of cooking solutions to households in Rwanda. But in most cases, the refugee households are not included in these national programs. And households are going to face some problems in connecting to the national grid, including around kind of safety requirements and kind of pre-connection requirements. So again, most are not connected. If we go to the next slide. Again, a number of stakeholders that are important in the humanitarian and energy space in Rwanda. Of course, the displaced and host communities, humanitarian actors, again, UNHCR, MINEMA is the government body overseeing the refugees in Rwanda. WFP, again, has a presence. There's also government stakeholders such as the Rwanda Energy Group, who are involved in the national grid extension, and stakeholders such as the Energy Development Corporation Limited and the Development Bank of Rwanda, who are administering some of the RBF programs in the country. Again, there's donor and development partners involved that it's important to coordinate with, and these include organizations that are working within the camps on energy and livelihoods, such as Practical Action, Alike, GIZ, and Practical Action are going to talk to us after this about a new program that they have are planning in Rwanda, which will be really interesting and important for stakeholders to coordinate with. There's also various finance providers and some that have already been working with the refugee communities. And these include Umatangua Finance Company, and there's also some that were supported under the RE4R program, such as Bellicom. So there's some stakeholders already active in that space. And again, there's private sector providers nationally, but again, some that have already been involved in providing products to refugees, such as Safe Gas, Eco-Green, who were supported under the RE4R program. So again, a good landscape of stakeholders to form the foundation for energy interventions. So we go to the next slide. Again, moving on to some of the data from Rwanda, humanitarian assistance was the most common source of income at both sites. A lot of households were relying on that. And then there were other sources of income from things such as NGO work, small commerce as well. And then in the host community, subsistence farming, public administration as well. Some things we did see, for example, we found that formal education within the population was quite high in Mahama compared to Nyabeheki. And again, in Nyabeheki, there's energy interventions that have already taken place under RE4R, so that has increased access to energy, but some gaps still remain. And I think with these two sites, more so than in Uganda, we saw, some of those differences between the sites. I think because of different interventions that have happened, and also the different communities that are based there. As we said, the national grid does extend into the refugee camps, but it's not connecting the households. So most of the households are still reliant on torches or other forms of lighting. In Mahama, refugees receive LPG in kind through UNHCR, although some households report it doesn't always cover their monthly needs completely, whereas in Nyabeheke, we saw more use of biomass fuels. Again, monthly spending on lighting was quite low at both sides, but spending on cooking fuel was higher. And the table shows some of the data there. So if we move to the next slide. So these graphs again show the primary lighting and power sources at each site. So on the left in Nyabeheke, we observed more use of solar home systems, I think through the work of the RE4R program, but also some households that are still relying on torches and other forms. National grid connections were there in the host community. In Mahama, it was almost exclusive national grid connections in the host community. And then within the refugee camps, there was more use of solar lanterns and torches as well. So again, there were some differences between the sites here. We'll move to the next slide. Again, this is summarizing some of the data that we found. Again, with cooking, it was almost exclusively LPG in Mahama due to the UNHCR intervention, whereas in Nyabeheke, there was more use of charcoal. And then within the host community, most households were still using firewood. And again, in Nyabeheke, still quite a high use of traditional three-stone fires. Okay, I think we go to the next slide. In terms of the market ecosystem, Mahama is the bigger site. We've noted that there may be some risk of some refugees returning home, but there could be additional allocations there as well. We did find at both sites there is existing product awareness. There seem to be interest in energy products. And given that Rwanda is a relatively small country, it's easier to integrate these sites within the national markets and to reach these sites as well. We didn't observe any major security issues at the site, so security was good. The relationships with the host community seemed good as well. We noted a higher presence of donated products in Mahama, whereas Nyabeheke households had more experience with market-based approaches for RE4R and also with loans for energy products. Again, there's a presence of private sector companies supplying energy products and services, but they still may need support to enter the settlement. We didn't observe any suppliers, for example, having a presence in Mahama. We observed high levels of mobile money usage and mobile phone usage, and also financial institutions in the area. Again, some that already had tailored products, that was positive as well. And again, the camps are more accessible, maybe when comparing with countries like Uganda or even Kenya. They're quite accessible nationally to reach the locations. But there's still some barriers for private sector entry that could be supported, such as streamlining entry into the camps or de-risking some of the investments for the private sector. And I think also looking to support retailers at the settlement level to improve the efficiency of delivering those products. Okay, next slide, please. Again, this is some of the data we found to support these observations. So again, you can see there was actually, some experience with formal banking services and then also semi-formal. It seemed to be slightly higher in Nyabeheke, experience with financial services. Access to mobile money and mobile phone ownership was high as well. So if we go to the next slide. Yeah, in terms of how energy interventions can align with community priorities, energy came out as a clear priority at both of the sites, particularly for the refugee households and for household cooking and lighting. For businesses, electricity for productive use and business financing were strong priorities. I think in Yabeheke, there's opportunities to build off the RE4R program, and we'll hear a bit more about what practical action are planning to do. There's been less existing energy programming in Mahama, but there's still opportunities, UNHCR's LPG program. There was also a mini grid already in the camp, so there's opportunities to build off that, and also to coordinate with other livelihood programming that's happening in the camps, with organizations such as GIZ and Alight. So yeah, opportunities to align and work with other partners. And the graphs here just show some of the priorities for action that came out of the focus groups and show some of the differences we found between priorities of men and women. So again, we see household cooking comes out strongly for women. And again, cooking and lighting comes out strongly for both men and women. And then there were a range of other priorities such as energy for manufacturing, agri-processing. So yeah, there was a keen interest definitely in increasing energy access from the community. We'll go to the next slide. Again, just sharing some of the data that came out from the focus groups here. Again, in the energy definitely came out very strongly in the refugee community, the host community, particularly in Mahama, because they had access to the grid. There were other priorities that came out as well. Okay, and we'll go to the next slide. So in terms of potential opportunities, there's definitely gaps that remain, particularly around household lighting, electricity for businesses, clean cooking. I think for households, this is likely to come from off-grid solar products, but for businesses and institutions, this could come through extending some of the grid connections. I think there's opportunities to continue to support clean cooking initiatives and the use of fuel-efficient stoves with biomass, and build off some of the interventions that have already taken place. And again, supporting the private sector, having the products available more locally, and having service centres and building awareness on energy products. Again, for businesses, supporting access to that higher tier electricity, and this could even be expanded to kind of hubs for training, market hubs, looking at various enterprises that could work from there. An important theme again that came out was around access to financing to help households and businesses access energy products. And I think again, there's opportunities to build off some of the work that MFIs have already been doing. And again, I think potentially some level of subsidy will be needed, because we did see quite a high reliance on humanitarian assistances, and potentially opportunities to look at the national subsidy schemes and how these could maybe be expanded to some of the refugee settlements. Okay, so I think that's the last slide on Rwanda. I've managed to get through it. Thank you for your patience. And as I mentioned, Practical Action do have a new program that's working in the humanitarian energy space in Rwanda. So I think Denise from Practical Action is going to say a few words to introduce that as well. Denise, are you on the line? Would you like to say a few words?
Denise, can you hear us?
Hi, Liv. Yes, I can hear you.
Perfect. Then over to you.
Oh, thanks very much. And apology for joining late. I was in another meeting and I was presenting my presentation took a little bit over. So I missed Lola's presentation, but I will share a few updates about RE4R. And for those that have not met before, my name is Denise Umobye. I'm the country director for Practical Action Rwanda. I've managed the first RE4R. I've managed the first renewable energy for refugees project, which was implemented in 3 camps. One of the camps was dissolved to the other one. So now we have beneficiaries in 2 camps and some beneficiaries that have moved to Mahama camp, which is the biggest camp in Rwanda. And we overall reached about 80 beneficiaries with community right. We installed solar street lights all over the camps. We managed to help the private sector to sell solar home system to more than 50% of the camp population of those 3 camps. Of those 2 camps, it was 70 before the relocation from one of the camp and the other part of the other to the new camp. And also over 50% with access to clean cooking. We have supported under the project 185 businesses to grow, where we provided a package of coaching, mentoring, creating peer-to-peer running platforms, as well as helping to create TA in general, helping to create business model, keeping records, and so on and so forth. And more than 50% of the businesses reported 80% of businesses reported having increased, their profit increased by 50% and over. We have also created about 2,000 jobs through recruitment of agents from the private sector, but also through recruitment into those businesses that were supported, and through a revolving fund that was set by one of our companies to support people with less purchasing power to be able to do small businesses so they can afford a solar home system. And those are the people who have never done businesses before. So they were prompted to do businesses. We have provided vocational training to about 20 youth who some of them got jobs, others are the ones that are being used for maintenance, upkeeping and repair of the energy technologies that are in the camp, including streetlights and solar home systems, as well as opportunity outside the camp. And a group of them actually founded a business that was supported through the productive use of energy component of the project. And the project was concluded in June last year, and the numbers I've just shared are numbers that were captured a few months after the project. They were slightly higher before project ended, but the deduction wasn't that high. And we were lucky to get funding for phase 2, which is now targeting all the camps. And we've just completed an assessment. We are trying to understand the major changes in the market after COVID, after camp relocation, and after what is happening all over in the world with the inflation caused by everything happening, including Ukraine and Russia. And that informed how we designed the intervention. The interventions are going to be more or less the same. We're going to, again, target or provide access at household, community, and business level. We have a few updates on the approach, and we are at stage where we are going to start engaging the private sector that we are going to be working with. And the process in which we engage the private sector is we first do advertise to prompt the interest, and after the interest, we get some offer. We do what we call supplier engagement workshops, where we call the suppliers. We tell them expectation from the project. We share market information from the assessment, And then after that, we facilitate camp visits, camp familiarization visits. We are interested private sector, meet refugee representative and some household, ask a few questions that then informs their designs for both the technologies and business model. So we are at stage where we have submitted proposed interventions to our donor, CEDA. We are waiting for their okay. They were part of the intervention design workshop. It was again a very thorough process where after the assessment, we discussed the assessment findings at the camp level with refugees and some stakeholders. Then we did some participatory market mapping exercises with all key stakeholders. And then we had a national intervention design or intervention selection workshop, which some of you might have participated, but also we had a donor in there. We had CEDA in the loan, so we are not anticipating a lot of surprises in terms of them approving our interventions. We aim on reaching 7% of the community with all interventions, and we are currently looking for more partnership to help with or target particularly on the productive use of energy, and also targeting the most vulnerable community on interventions with which the pure market-based approach cannot really tackle. Yeah, so we are waiting to hear from the donor, and then we are on standby to put out the advert for the private sector to express their interest, so we can start the process of engaging them. Then the co-creation process starts just after the camp familiarization visit. I think that is the update I can share. The budget is about 6.5 million for 4 years in all camps and the surrounding host community. I think that is all I can share, but I can answer questions if there are any. Again, apologies for me being late.
Thank you, Denise. It's great to get that update, and really positive to hear that you'll be continuing some of the work of the RE for our program. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Denise, and we're looking forward to hearing what comes up with practical action in the upcoming months. So before we move on to the Q&A session, we'll do another poll, same question, but now for Rwanda. And in light of what is mentioned by Laura, talking about the risking private sector to support entry to markets, supporting retailers to improve efficiency, or opportunities for connecting to the national grid, you all heard from her, and you can compare and contrast how Rwanda might be different than Uganda in terms of prioritization of actions. So I'll wait a couple minutes for you to fill in the poll. And user financing seems to be the front runner here as well, with a close follow-up from the access to flexible commercial funding for energy companies. I think those two goes hand in hand, almost like supply and demand side support mechanisms. And Laura, please feel free to jump in with your reflections.
Yeah, I'm not seeing the poll results, but yeah, I think there are things that we did see come out as well. Yeah.
Me and the poll so we can all see the results. So can you see the results now, Laura? Okay.
Yes, I can see them now. Yeah, I think it's similar, and user financing was something that came out strongly. And again, it's that it's not one single action. It's kind of, that holistic approach of looking at, various barriers and various ways to support that. Yeah.
And I think we also see increased community engagement in designing and implementing energy interventions, which I think is very close to what Denise mentioned about community engagement for the Practical Actions Project, RE4R. So it's good to see that this is becoming more and more important in the interventions going forward. So with this, I think we can move on to the Q&A round. So please share your questions with us on the chat and we'll be happy to answer them. And to start us off, unfortunately, even though Richa had to left, we can start with her question on the origins of displaced people for the Uganda presentation. She's saying that while it's no surprise that majority were from South Sudan and Congo, it's surprising that there is no country outside of Africa with the Arab Spring happening and plans of some of European and UK countries to send asylum seekers to Rwanda. She says that she was thinking there would be more non-African countries in the mix as well. So I was wondering if that was about the date that was happening, or is there something else to the data that gives an insight to this?
Yeah, for that data, I think we'd really looked at the UNHCR sources, and they have some really good data on their websites, which they tend to update, which gives some of the facts on the situations in each country. So it was also for those specific sites. So, for example, I think in Rwanda, there are non-African refugees, asylum seekers. I'm not sure of the classification, but they may just not have been in those sites, and I think that's the majority. So yes, that could be the case. I think UNHCR's data is a good source and is what we use to get some of those facts. But yeah, I hope that answers the question.
I think Richa also had a question about the appliance ownership other than the lightning, but I think Rebecca covered that on the chat. So maybe we can move on to the question by Claudine. They're asking to what extent clean cooking promotion in humanitarian settings in Rwanda could be integrated into and therefore benefit from the wider national level clean cooking initiatives, for example, the RVF-based Clean Cooking Fund. Yeah, I think that's a great idea, and I think was something that we saw that there are opportunities given that the systems are being set up at the kind of national level to potentially expand that. I think it would require some more conversations to understand if that's possible, or how that would be made possible, whether it needs further donor support for these particular sites. But I think that's definitely an opportunity that is worth exploring further. Yeah. We have another question from Clemens asking the main drivers for high uptake of LPG in Rwanda compared to Uganda, and if there are any lessons to be learned or replicated for the Ugandan settings. Yeah, so I think the driver in Mahama for the uptake of LPG is that it's being provided by UNHCR. So the refugees are not paying for it, it's being provided. And I think that's part of efforts to reduce the use of biomass and get people using cleaner fuels. At the same time, that can, on the downside, that can be quite costly. We've seen a lot of fluctuation in the LPG market. And we didn't observe retail points for LPG. So I think if households did use it, we thought maybe, it would be good if there were opportunities that they could buy it separately. So there were still some other fuels being used. But I think it's a really interesting example. I think we've seen some other examples from other countries where the government and humanitarian organizations have supported the uptake of LPG. And I think there's really good lessons to learn from that. I think there's pros and cons. Maybe there's ways where
it's not the full cost that's subsidized. You can offer smaller subsidies, energy for impact, for example. We looked at this idea of a clean cooking concession, where you would kind of cap the price at LPG at something that could be affordable. So I think as well, it's often country specific, looking at what's the LPG supply chain, what's the cost of different fuels in that country to try and understand what could be suitable. But yeah, I think there's definitely some lessons that can be learned from Rwanda and some of the other countries that have been promoting LPG with displaced communities.
We have another question from Gabrielle asking what should be the best incentive to attract private sector to refugee settings. De-risking sometimes comes with the risk of losing business innovativeness among businesses.
Yeah, it's a good question. I feel like kind of to have the private sector respond to this, but I think it's true. I think often it's allowing the private sector to do what they do in these settings. So whether that's removing some of the barriers to entry or helping them understand the market demand, or having data on these settings, so they can more organically start to include some of these locations, rather than it kind of like say having to be a one-off project or a kind of special initiative of the company, how to kind of integrate some of these settings more organically and holistically into the networks. Rebecca, I don't know from if you wanted to add anything to that from the work on the assessments as well.
I think you covered it there in terms of being as open as possible so that businesses can be innovative, that you provide the framework and with which they can work, rather than being very specific or definitive about what it is that you want.
Let me check the chat if we have any other questions coming. Please feel free to send them so we can discuss more about this assessments and how they can explore potential opportunities going forward. Maybe a question from me, Laura. After doing this assessments in 2 different countries, how do you reflect back on the differences between those two and what we can learn from them as a consequence?
Yeah, I think we did see some differences, and again, that's why it's always important to understand, local context and not, make too broad assumptions when looking at different countries and different sites. I think understanding the kind of humanitarian situation, like how long have people maybe been at sites, because that makes a difference. If people arrive recently, maybe they've been there longer. We even saw that difference within the 2 sites in Rwanda. Again, that can affect kind of the skills within the community, the education levels in the community, kind of their background and the situation they've come from. Again, I think at the country level, understanding supply chains is quite important, like where, the markets at each site, what suppliers are available, even understanding kind of transport networks. Like in Rwanda, it's quite easy to reach, that you can drive there and back in a day, whereas in Uganda, that they're quite far in the north, maybe have to fly there or drive for a whole day to reach some of these sites. So some of those things make a difference as well. In both countries, there's quite positive policies towards refugees, and also I think a lot of support for the energy markets was probably some of the similarities, but yeah, and I think just the scale, Uganda has a much, the population, the refugees is much bigger. So there's potentially more opportunities for scale and interventions to reach more people.
Thank you so much. So Natalia asks, you mentioned for Rwanda, MFIs could play a role for delivering energy loans and give an example of one of them. Are you connecting with MFIs in the outreach of these areas, sharing the market results and following up on the financial product development?
So I'm hoping, I don't know if any joined the call today or this dissemination. For us at this stage, this is, we've done the assessment and we're planning to disseminate some of these results, but we're not at this stage kind of directly working with MFIs to develop products. If there's opportunities that came up, or potentially through the RE4R program, that could be something that's going to be looked at. And yeah, we're kind of happy to share some more of the findings with them and with stakeholders that are engaging with them as well. But there's no specific follow-on plans that we have right now to develop products, but hopefully we'll be supporting the stakeholders that are.
Perfect. Do we have any other questions from the participants? If not, I think we can close this webinar. Thank you so much to our speakers, Emmanuel, Laura, and Denise, for sharing their valuable insights with us, and you, the participants, for taking the time to join this webinar and asking your questions, especially considering that we are approaching the end of the year business. I also want to thank my colleague Sadiq, who has been the technical support behind organizing this webinar. And as mentioned several times, the presentation and the recording of this webinar will be available at the GPA events page posted on the chat. So we hope you join us for the second webinar on the 13th of December for hearing more about Somalia and Niger sites. We wish you a lovely day and hope to see you at the next webinar. Thank you. Bye.